Hello and good evening, morning, and afternoon to everyone from Qatar. My name is Sarmad, and I'll be your event moderator today. I'd like to welcome everyone. Today is the second in a water security series organized by Idrica. Our focus today is on the important region of Middle East. Spanning from Lebanon to the coast of Oman on the strategic Strait of Hormuz, and abundant in oil, but yet one of the most water-scarce regions in the world, Middle East is witnessing a number of changes in water security challenges. These range from increasing desertification, changes in agricultural patterns, weather changes, frequent droughts, all the way to dropping freshwater reservoirs and rapid urbanization. Further compounding these problems are the geopolitical concerns of the region, where threats of disrupting water supplies often loom. For example, in 2017, in Qatar, where I'm sitting in, the country was put under an economic and social blockade from some of its neighbors. And in fact, one of the first issues that were discussed by the Qatari government was to float the idea of securing fresh water supplies via pipelines from Turkey or Iran. So we can see how important water is to nations. Joining us today are two of the world's foremost subject matter experts, David Kicullen and Jaime Barba. David is named one of the world's top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine, the world's leading international policy journal. Dr. Kilcullen is famous for his TED Talk on the future of coastal cities. He is considered the world's leading expert on counterinsurgency. His latest book, Dragons and Snakes, was published last month, receiving rave reviews in the global and print edition of the Financial Times. All his public interventions have worldwide media coverage. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, he was contacted by international media outlets to explain the upcoming problems such as the Washington Post, Bloomberg, or the Australian. He has been repeatedly interviewed on Charlie Rose's show, one of the most important television journalists in the world today. Dr. Kilcullen served in Baghdad as a member of the Joint Strategic Assessment Team and as Senior Counterinsurgency Advisor, Iraq's multinational force in 2007 at the time, before he became Special Counterinsurgency Advisor to the US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, in 2008. He was the US State Department's representative to the 2008 Afghanistan-Pakistan Strategic Review and lead author of the US Government Counterinsurgency Handbook. In Afghanistan, he founded the ISAF Counterinsurgency Advisory Assistance Team in 2009, serving as an advisor to the ISAF commander, and was a senior research scientist in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which ran a country program for Afghanistan at the time. Dr. Kilcullen has taught at universities and military schools in the United States and Europe, making academic contributions to guerrilla warfare theory, insurgency and counterinsurgency, future conflicts, human geography, urban studies, or the problems of access to water resources. He holds a BA with honors in politics and English from the University of New South Wales in Australia, an MA in management from the University of Canberra, a postgraduate diploma in linguistics from the Australian Defence Force Language School, and a PhD from the University of New South Wales. His books, The Accidental Guerrilla and Counterinsurgency, are used by several universities as well as by policymakers, the military intelligence services, and development agencies around the world. Accidental Guerrilla was in fact a Washington Post bestseller. We're really glad to have Dr. Kilcullen with us today. Jaime Barba is the global CEO of Idrica, one of the world leaders in technology applied to water resources management. Jaime has a degree in telecommunications engineering from the Polytechnic University of Valencia in Spain. He has more than 20 years of experience in the water sector. Throughout his professional career in the world of water resources, Jaime has held positions of responsibility for over a decade, including CEO of GoHub, the Open Innovation Hub for Deep Tech, Industry 4.0, and Smart Cities. He's also been the Director of Digital Transformation at Global Omnium and Director of Information Systems at Grupo Aguas de Valencia, a 130-year-old company that manages the water of 400 municipalities in Spain. Jaime is considered one of the most relevant figures in the water world, a leader in the digital transformation of the industry, literally. We're really glad to have Jaime with us today as well. I'd like to welcome once again all our audience members today. For everyone's information, this session is being recorded, and we will be uploading this entire webinar on Idrica's website. Please, we encourage you to send us your questions in the relevant chat box so we can address them for you. To get things flowing, let me invite David to share his insights on today's topic. David, please go ahead.
Sarmad, thank you for that. And thank you to Jaime and to the team for the opportunity to be part of this, this great event. I'm going to share some slides, and I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes or so on some ideas about conflict and water. And then, of course, hand back to you, Sarmad, and we can continue the discussion. So let me share my screen here. Let me just confirm that everybody can see that. Can you see that, Sarmad?
Yes, it's perfect, David. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So I want to talk about water and conflict in a time of pandemic. And I want to use the framing of what the World Health Organization and a number of aid agencies call complex emergencies. So these are situations of disrupted livelihoods, threats to life that can be produced by warfare, civil disturbance, mass population movement, and in particular in which any response to that crisis is complicated by a difficult political and security environment. And I think you'll agree that very much describes the situation in many places right now that are facing the COVID-19 pandemic. There are a number of recent examples, the Congo, the Ebola and cholera outbreaks across Africa, the combination of drought, famine, and currently a very major locust plague in the Horn of Africa and also in South Sudan. A number of examples from the period of the uprisings of the Arab Spring, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment. And then another example, which is very commonly referred to in Australia and Southeast Asia, is the situation in Myanmar with a combination of Rakhine separatists and the experience of the Rohingya population in Myanmar. So complex emergencies tend to be multi-phase. They tend to involve mutually exacerbating impacts from multiple causes. Those causes tend to compound over time, and it's the combination of effects that tends to hamper a response. And as we'll see, water is almost always a central issue in issues of this kind, in complex emergencies. So let me just illustrate the centrality of water to these kinds of emergencies through a number of examples. This is the Mavil Aru sluice gate, which was the scene of a very major conflict in July of 2006, when the Tamil Tigers, the insurgent group in Sri Lanka, turned off the water to more than 1 million Sri Lankan farmers in low-lying areas in eastern Sri Lanka by shutting off the irrigation system that allowed them to maintain a livelihood. Within a matter of days, the Sri Lankan military had responded, and this event triggered both a major battle and ultimately the eventual destruction of the Tamil Tigers by forcing the government to act, and also by generating a lot of public support for those actions. So the water issue really was central to the end of the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. Likewise in Egypt, in the period of the beginning of the uprisings of the Arab Spring, there was a very significant difference between the attitude of urban populations to the Mubarak government and the attitude of people in the countryside, who very much depended on the government for access to irrigation and to river water to sustain their livelihoods. And this is a general theme that we'll come back to, that urban environments tend to be much more fragile in terms of access to water, and the relationship between the state and the population is mediated through the critical commodity of water. And when the state fails to provide that, it can lead to conflict very quickly. Syria is perhaps the best example of this. The very first locations within Syria to experience violence during the Syrian civil war were areas that had received a very significant influx of civilians, mostly farmers from the countryside, as a result of a major drought that happened in 2010 and 2011 across Syria. So these populations moved to urban environments. They put stress on cities that were already barely coping in terms of their water infrastructure. And then when people began to protest because of lack of water, and the government denied people access to water supply, this rapidly became a major conflict, which then spiraled out of control across about a dozen cities in Syria within a matter of days. So one of the illustrations here is that if you don't have access to food, it is a crisis, but it might take 2 or 3 weeks before that crisis becomes acute. If you don't have access to medical care or to electricity or to many other essential requirements for life, there may never be a crisis, because these are things that take a long time to develop. But in the case of water, if you don't get immediate relief within a matter of hours, people will start to die. And so the connection between water and conflict is extremely close across many areas, and in particular in the Middle East, where, as Sarmad mentioned, water is so scarce. In Misrata in Libya, a town in central Libya, in July 2011, this is a still from combat footage of rebels fighting the Syrian regime, sorry, the Libyan regime. This isn't natural water that you can see people running through. It's actually raw sewage coming up from broken sewage systems across the urban environment in Misrata. One of the issues in Libya that encouraged the outbreak of the conflict was the uneven distribution of water that was produced from the western part of the country and the eastern part. So eastern Libya in Cyrenaica produced much more water, whereas the western part of the country, where Gaddafi, the leader of Libya at the time, came from, received much more than it contributed. And at the same time, sewage systems, access to sanitation, and other water supply issues were very uneven across the country. And that was one of the major drivers of unrest that led to the conflict in 2011. That's not unique to the Middle East, and it's also not unique to war zones. This is the distribution in an outlying suburb of Delhi in India of water from a tanker truck to a population in an informal settlement. India, like many other countries in the world, if you live in the middle of the city and in a developed area, you are likely to have dramatically better water access and access to sanitation than if you live in an outlying suburb or in an informal settlement. The government commits to provide water to everybody in the city, but the further out you go from the center of town, the harder it is to access that water. And gaps have been created in government service which civil society groups have filled, as have private companies. But in some cases, these have also been taken over by organized crime networks who use access to water, or the denial of access to water, as a way of controlling populations. And as I say, this is not unique to India. It's actually a very widespread set of circumstances. In the rise of Islamic State in the war in Iraq and Syria, water resources became a critical element of the internal conflict. This is a photograph taken in August of 2014 of Kurdish forces having just recaptured the Mosul Dam, which provided not only electricity but also drinking water to the second city of Iraq, which by this point was controlled by the Islamic State. And if you look at a map of the control areas of the Islamic State, it's very clear that one of the key objectives of this group was to control access to dams, lakes, hydroelectric power plants, and to the Euphrates River and the broader Tigris and Euphrates watershed as a key way of controlling cities and controlling populations. So again, even if we're talking about a guerrilla group or a group that wanted to be a state in the form of the Islamic State, the access to water became a very critical element of the fighting that emerged around that conflict. Today in Al-Hudaydah in Yemen, we are seeing one of the worst humanitarian crises that we've seen across the region in living memory. And both sides, both the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthi rebels who are fighting each other in that city, have at different times targeted food and water resources. There's at least some evidence that these have been accidental attacks in both cases, but it certainly makes sense for combatants to try to control access to water because it immediately brings with it control of populations and territories, as we've seen with the Islamic State. And then the final type of conflict that we may see, and again involving a complex emergency, can be interstate conflict over access to critical water resources such as rivers and lakes. Right now, there is an ongoing dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt over this dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile. And there have been threats over the past couple of years of airstrikes, of sabotage, and of uprisings against the Ethiopian government as a result of what many people in Egypt see as an illegitimate attempt to control the Nile River. We'll probably talk later about water disputes and how they can best be resolved. But this is a great example of the kinds of disputes that we see among states with respect to water resources. So applying that set of ideas to the current pandemic and thinking about it as a complex emergency, it's possible to model the pandemic as a multi-phase emergency where we see a series of waves of crisis that involve the onset of crisis, a peak impact, a period of recovery, then potentially a series of recurring additional peaks, and then finally a reset. And in most cases, the beginning of the crisis has involved a public health crisis. And I've mapped that here with one second wave example, but of course, we may see multiple follow-on recurrence incidents. And we may see second or third or fourth waves being even more significant in their public health impact than the first one. And one of the problems at present is that we really don't have enough information to make a clear prediction about that. But what we can be very clear about is that following on from the public health crisis, in every place where the pandemic has arrived, we've seen an economic impact, which tends to lag behind the public health impact, but to be much more severe in terms of its economic and possibly public health disruption. And then following on from the economic impact of the public health crisis, we are already starting to see significant security implications in terms of human security for populations who've lost their jobs or have lost access to critical commodities, in terms of internal security within countries that are affected by the coronavirus. And we're even starting to see an increase in risk of interstate conflict as a result. So that third wave is a security crisis. If we look at the cumulative impact of all these different elements, public health, economics, and security, certainly in the case of Europe, of North America, Australasia, and the other countries in East Asia, for example, who have been part of the first wave, the likely peak cumulative impact of all three elements here is likely to occur around the end of this year, so at the end of the fourth quarter of 2020 and into 2021. For other places in Africa, in Latin America, and in the Middle East, the impact may be somewhat delayed into 2021. But the point that I think is fairly obvious here is that it isn't the coronavirus itself that generates this kind of complex emergency. It's the interaction of multiple different kinds of effects, all peaking around the same time. We can't simply wait out the crisis. There are a number of underlying conditions that have shaped it. Urbanization, in particular, a reliance on very complex, distantiated, and fragile systems. And the water and sanitation system is probably the prime example of that, as we saw in our Arab Spring examples. Globalization is another underlying condition: mass air travel, trade reliance, economic specialization among countries. A sinocentric, just-in-time global supply ecosystem has also increased fragility. We've seen the emergence over the past 20 years of a global system that emphasizes efficiency over resilience. It seeks to optimize rather than to innovate. And in recent years, in the last, say, 4 to 5 years, we've seen a very significant return of great power conflict and economic nationalism. One of the features of the impacts of the coronavirus is that they're mostly government mandated. Many governments are treating the current crisis like an extreme weather event. They're directing communities to shelter in place until it passes, and then planning for a subsequent recovery and reopening once it's gone. Now that works for weather emergencies because they only typically last a few days. So they tend to be over before key supplies run out: food, water, and so on. Using the United States as an example, most US supermarkets only hold 3 to 4 days of supply, of days on hand. So if you're going to shut down your economy, that doesn't work, because we're now on day 50, 48 to 50, depending on where you are in the US, of a shelter in place order. And that's between 12 and 16 cycles of supply. And in the case of water, the ability to maintain infrastructure, workforces in critical locations, and the supply of water to distribution points is also going to be affected very soon. And populations will tend to blame, punish, and deny governments, incumbent governments, at all levels as a result of them blaming the impact of the coronavirus on government. So we're likely to see a human security crisis followed by internal stability, and then potentially followed by internal conflict. So just to wrap up, the implications are fairly profound. Uneven access to water across urban areas is likely to drive unrest. It's likely to push population movement and exacerbate already existing infrastructure overstretch. And as we've seen, water crises immediately become triggers for security breakdowns because there's such an immediate critical impact on the survivability of a population. One of the implications of that is that cross-leveling and real-time awareness of water resources across rural, urban, and megacity areas is critical. So smart meters, the ability to share and rapidly update water data, a clear understanding of the water supply chain, all things that companies like Idrica specialize in, are likely to be extremely important for governments to understand the impact of the crisis on their cities. We're going to see disruption to typical water usage patterns for specific applications: sanitation and hand washing, restaurants and food service venues, coal and other forms of mining production, manufacturing, and other industrial and agricultural processes. So again, the ability to track changes in water usage is going to be really important in understanding the impact of the crisis. It's also true that understanding water data and the way that their usage of water is changing is likely to be one of the very few leading indicators that allow us to predict the course of the crisis. Maintenance and security of water infrastructure under conditions of lockdown and labor shortage is also going to be extremely important as a problem set that cities will need to deal with, as will national governments as the coronavirus continues. There will be a need for surge capacity of water, of workforce, and of critical infrastructure to deal with potential population displacement, to avoid the kind of situation that we saw in Syria, where mass population movement as a result of water shortage overstressed infrastructure and then led to unrest. Using the India example, but again, it's not unique to India, there is a danger of criminal networks exploiting water distribution weakness in various cities as a way of gaining control over populations. And of course, as the Blue Nile example shows, there's also the danger of weaponization of water resources as part of a conflict. So let me stop there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can.
Thank you, David. That was an excellent commentary there. I was particularly intrigued. Your mention of the locust plague in the Eastern African belt, and I don't know if I understand that not many people realize that yes, it's in the East African region, but it actually started from the empty quarter in Oman. The desert part of it. Where there was a period of unusual rains. So once again, we can see how water, impacts us all, and currently it's doing so in Africa. I'm pretty sure we'll have more questions to follow up. And that makes me remind all the participants to please send in your questions so we can address them. Now, David has set the geopolitical and global resource scene for us. I now invite Jaime to share with us the technology and innovation side of the water security management. And I'm sure that his views and insights will be as interesting as David's. Jaime, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sarmad. Share the screen. Are you watching the screens? Can you confirm?
Yes, it's perfect. Go ahead, please.
So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for your presentation, David. It has been amazing to hear what should happen with the water security, physical water security in the world, and probably the effects of COVID in the world now. Okay, we need water. We are talking about that we need water, and we need water not just to live. We need water not just for health reasons. We need water for agriculture, for industry. Here you have the water footprint per capita in the world in different countries. And as you can see here, almost all the countries in the world need more than the 36 meter cubics per capita that the UN recommends for healthy reasons. And the main reason, of course, is that, as all we know, is the agriculture and is the industry. When we use the water for agriculture, we need a lot of water, but in industry, for manufacturing cellulars, for manufacturing sneakers, we need a great amount of water. We need especially water for producing meat, for producing with cows, maintaining the cattle, and we need it's something that is usually we usually don't know. But the countries that more water footprint have are the countries that more meat are producing. So we need water. We know that. We don't have water. This is the second point. There is water, but not enough in the world, and we don't use we don't use properly the element. We don't use the water in an efficient way, efficiently. So we need to maintain the service efficiently because it's mandatory for us because we don't have water. Here you have, for example, a comparison in the country where we come from Spain, a comparison between 2 years of the water state in the country. You can see that the same month in different years, separated 3 years between both of them, tell us that the country is deserting. So we have been working a lot because we need this water to be efficient. So we don't only need now as a challenge to be efficient with the water, we need now to absorb the service, because COVID has told us that we need to maintain the service, to maintain infrastructures from our home. So we have another challenge different to the challenge of the efficiency. We have the absorbing challenge. But there is good news. If we have the good tools, if we have the good solutions, we can join the two needs, because the same solutions that we need to be efficient are the solutions that allow us to absorb the service. And these solutions allows us first to be transparent. We can tell the customers, we can tell the citizens, we can tell the government what's happening in the management of water. For example, we can tell that we have workers in the street cleaning the sewage network, and we can tell them where. And for example, we can tell that we have taken samples to analysis the quality of water, and we are showing which is the level of the quality of water in each time, in each place. So we can be transparent with the government and with the citizens. Secondly, we can be efficient. We will talk about this. We shouldn't lose the water. We shouldn't maintain the water, the resource that we have. And in third place, we should be resilient. When we have troubles, when we have disasters, natural disasters, when we have sandstorms, when we have droughts, floods, whatever, we should be able to maintain the service in the same way that in regular conditions. And we can do that if we are able, for example, to use a digital twin to analyze what's going to happen if we break any kind, or we have we cannot use any kind of facility in the network that we are managing. So we should be able to do this, and for example, to analyze what's happening when we have a pandemic, that we are not ready for that. So which kind of tools we can use for this? For example, in plants, in drinking water treatment plants and in wastewater treatment plants, we should not be dependent of the SCADA teams, that are the engineers that usually analyze all what's happening in this kind of infrastructures. We should digitalize the service and be able to access to any kind of information of the network, any kind of sensor in an autonomous way for any kind of people in an organization in any kind of skill. So different skills in the organization should be autonomous to get this kind of information. And when we have digitized the plants, we have digitized even the networks, we are able after that to run algorithms to be efficient, to have energy efficiency, or for example, to be efficient in the plants with the chemical products, or to automatize the plants after drinking as the wastewater, or to analyze when the blowers in a wastewater plant should be switched on because of the efficiency of the energy, or even make templates for running the plant in different ways when it's raining, or for example when we have agriculture campaigns in our country, our orange campaigns or grapes campaigns change the decoration process. So what about the networks? In the networks, we should maintain the service constant. We should have constant pressure for the network, and to automatize what's going to happen in the next 15 minutes with the digital twin in a forecast demand process, and to change the behavior of the valves and the pumps to maintain this constant pressure in an automatical way. And we should, for example, be able to analyze if we don't have a continuous service. If we discontinue the service, we should have early warning to our customer and to alert them when we are going to repose the service. And for example, if we discontinue this kind of service, we should alert that we have the quality of water of the tanks, if we have tanks, is the properly one, because when we continue another time the service, we are drying the biofilm, and probably we have bacteria or Legionella in the tanks, and the community, the citizens should be safe about this kind of situations. So in the networks, in the sewage networks, we should analyze the extraction. We should homogenize with the pumping the level of water in the sewage network, and to homogenize the water that we are sending to the plant. We should to be able to analyze if we lose covers when it's raining a lot in the network. Related to the leaks, we should be able to use all the technology that is in the market to analyze leaks. We should use models to find these leaks. We should use hydraulic balance to cross smart metering information with DMAs information if we have DMAs, to analyze, for example, that we have leaks or not, or maybe not, because we have consumption inside a household, and we should be able to analyze this because we have this smart metering. So we need to cross data and to run all the kinds of information that we have. Smart metering. We should have patterns of consumption, and if we have leaks inside the households, we should alert our customers that they have this kind of leaks, that they have a tap dripping, and we should have the customer-centric view to have the workflows ready to answer to our customer, and not be dependent of the customer care people, that the system run a way of behavior focused on the customer, and of course to have good billing systems to attend the different level of tariffs in a flexible way. And all these things, we should do it in a holistic way, crossing all the information. Usually in the companies, we have silos of information that are connecting different kind of information, not badly. They connect everything with everything, and it's impossible for the different skills in an organization to analyze the information, to cross information from a customer, from information from leaks, from information from the network. This is usually difficult to do. We need a holistic solution. We need to cross data, and a data-centric solution, and to give information to every skills of an organization. And what happened when we began to have COVID-19? I told before that we had good news. We had all the technology. This technology make us efficient. And now that we have the COVID situation, we can absorb the service. For example, if we have to apply a social tariff in a quickly, we are able to do that because of the systems that allow, the tools that allow us that. And to communicate it quickly to the customer, because we are able to make this, because we have the tools to communicate continuously to the customer the things. We can analyze and explain to our government. For example, this is real data from Europe that we are going to increase the use of digital channels for running the formalities at 34%. Or for example, if we have the patterns of consumption, we are able to tell the government, the people that is fulfilling or not the confinement, if we have confinement, or to explain the distribution of the people, to analyze when we can go to which hospital in different situations, because we know which people is inside the households. And we can, for example, alert that one people that is alone and is all people and dependent people in their houses, we can alert the families that they have not consumption in all day. So we can explain that the situation is really bad for this person. Or for example, we're able to find leaks in industries and in shops that are closed. We know that they are consuming continuously, so we are going to alert for them to be safe, that they have leaks inside the households. Or for example, we can know that at 8 o'clock in the evening that everyone is in the balcony clapping for the sanitaries, we are going to change the consumption, and when they come back, we are going to have an increase of the water. This is going to be similar to a football event, an important football event, but every day, and the network should respond to this, and we should be flexible enough to understand what's happening with the network. We are able to analysis that we have decreased the consumption between 7 and 14%. This is data of Europe too, because of the industrial stops, and now we know that even we have the households consuming more, the industries are consuming quite less. And we can have the workers inside their homes. They don't should go out just for the minimum and just for the essential things. We are able for for our workers to prioritize the work and to program this work, because we are in a holistic solution that have the smart decisions. So all these kind of things are ready because of the technology. This is the good phase, but there is a bad phase in all this. There is hackers in the world, and they are bad guys, and they try to access to all our infrastructures and to break all the security, all the cyber security. And so when we deploy the solutions, we should deploy the solutions with cybersecurity protection. What do they do? For example, in SCADAs, sometimes the politics of the SCADAs have the passwords easy to access, and they can try, this is a real situation, they can try to access to a pump and switch on and off continuously until they break the pump. Or for example, they can try to change the chemical products proportions, and that's dangerous, of course. Or for example, they can to sell to some commercial company the patterns of consumption if they achieve to that information, they get that information. So we need to have a defense for them. Which kind of defense? There is technology, there is good technology, and when we deploy solutions, we have to deploy this technology. Zones that sniff what's happening in PLCs and correlate a usual behavior of a facility with a different behavior, with an attempt of a hacker to access. Or for example, hardware, a layer of hardware, because usually we have devices from different manufacturers, and we need that these different manufacturers don't have between them holes of security. That's usual. So we should have a device to have a layer of provision for these manufacturers of hardware to maintain the firmware constant and to don't have this kind of holes. We should codify the radio networks. And for example, in chemical products, we should have best practices. Maybe we should decide that we cannot automatize that and that we have to give recommendations to the operators, but we need a finger of a person to decide the proportion. And all these things that are technology should have best practices after them. If we don't have the best practices, we are not going to do anything. We need to analyze which is the critical infrastructure, and we should coordinate this with government and make plans. The plan is everything. We need to have plans for this to happen. Maybe in the dialogue we can explain the plans that we have made for COVID. We have been protected in the places where we manage just because of the plan. The plan is everything, and the coordination with government and other administration is everything too. So we need to coordinate every the actors in this situation. And finally, it's never enough. We shouldn't stop the protection. We need a cyber SOC. We have experience in deploying cyber SOC to protect 24/7 from the cloud and from the hackers. In these people that is in the cyber SOC should, for example, make ethical hacking, or for example, should prepare a false depuration plan for the hackers to try to attempt to attack it. And we should analyze the patterns of the attack for learn about how they do it in the places that we are running. And in the top, for example, we should have a digital twin of the quality of water. We need for this multi-parametric zone, but and a high investment. But if we have this, we know what's going to happen in the next 15 minutes of the network if the composition of water change. So this is going to protect the cities, to protect the citizens. So we should maintain this kind of solutions, protecting the citizens. We come from Spain. I have told that we have been working. We come from a company from Aguas de Valencia company that is a company with more than 125 years of experience. We have developed a lot of solutions inside, and what we have is a package of technological solutions for all that we are explaining now, and we have also the services the services related to all the cycle of water. Consultancy, engineering, operational maintenance, all the cycle of water is included in the services that we manage. So we are cycle of water experts in the world. This is the places that we are. We are in Middle East. We are in other places in the world. And thank you so much for your attention. And I'm here to answer the questions that you have.
Thank you, Jaime. That was fantastic to listen to. Thank you so much. You know, you mentioned treatment of plants, and I couldn't help but think that in Qatar, for example, the municipal water is potable, you know, and the officials in the municipality tell you that you should have no problem drinking it, provided it doesn't go through the water tank. But yet culturally, because of all the wealth we have, people just go on and buy refillable plastic bottles or disposable ones. We are way off the Paris Agreement. Our CO2 footprint is very high. And I was actually wondering if I could actually ask you a question, and perhaps this can now kick off our Q&A session by asking you if there's anything if there are ways that can be implemented at the water treatment level to achieve climate neutral targets for different nations.
Yeah, of course. It's a mindset thing, as you have told. It's a culture thing, not to drink water from the tap. Not just in Qatar, in a lot of nations in the world, the water is drinkable, but it's not in the culture is to use bottles. Okay, and to change that, we need campaigns. We need to be close to the customer, and we need tools to be close to the customer. We need to have workflows for when the customer approach to us, they feel comfortable, and this is not usual in a utility, because the utility usually are come from the administration and are far away of the citizens, because they are enforced customers, and they are captive customers. So usually the mindset of the utility and the tools that the utility have to do this is not enough good to make this kind of campaigns. So this kind of campaigns approach the change of mindset in the citizens and in the utility, both of them, I mean the administration, both of them should change.
Yes, you're indeed right, Jaime, because we can have all the technology and innovation in the world applied to these challenges, but yet if the people are not on board, how can you make any impact? So thank you very much for taking that. We are receiving several questions from our audience members. If I can now go to David and pose one of the several questions we've received here for him. David, you mentioned earlier in your presentation state-on-state conflict. A case that comes to my mind is the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty between India and Pakistan, two of the world's nuclear-armed neighbors. And in your opinion, the question is, what is the best way to resolve water-related disputes between two states? Is it by using a multilateral system, such as the United Nations, or within themselves, like bilaterally, or with the use of an arbitrator? Please.
Yeah, this is a great question. And one of the comments in the Q&A also raised the question about water disputes between the US and Mexico, which is a similar problem, and similar again to the Blue Nile dispute that I mentioned earlier. I think that when two countries do not have a very significant geopolitical power imbalance, that a bilateral solution is almost always best, but there needs to be some kind of mediating or moderating body. So you could argue that in the Blue Nile case, the African Union has played a very important role in that respect. But I do think there are cases where one country might be dramatically more powerful than another in a dispute. And in that circumstance, I think there would be certainly a strong case for a multilateral approach. So I know that's not necessarily a satisfying answer. It's a sort of it depends, but I think in most of the cases that I have seen, so regional disputes among Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and so on in the Middle East is one example. Egypt and Ethiopia is another. A regionally based solution with some kind of mediating body is likely to be better, I think, than either straight bilateral or fully multilateral.
Thank you. Thanks, David. We are getting a lot of questions here. Jaime, this is direct, excuse me. This one is directed to you. Basically, in almost all the Gulf states here in the Middle East, citizens enjoy free water supply, but increasingly that calls are increasing to gradually introduce some sort of billing or partial billing for the citizens to discourage the unlimited supply mindset, which is kind of the golden cage concept. Are there technologies that you have at Idrica, such as in the area of smart metering, maybe, where an innovative billing method can be introduced without causing mass public protests? Please.
Yeah, yes. For example, to be able to deploy different tariffs, you need to have a good structured tariff system to deploy them. Our history is that we, in the places that we have different regulations for different municipalities, for different cities. So finally, in the technology that we manage, we have more than 400 cities with more than 400 different regulations, managing with the same kind of systems. So, and not from now, from the last 100 years. What happened when you leave that is that the tariff of each municipality, the tariff of each city, can be the more ingenious that you can imagine. Okay, all the cities decide different things. In fact, for example, I know that a city that is billing the water depending on number of animals in farms, because it's a city with a lot of farms, and they decided that this is the unity that they should use for billing the water. So our systems are ready for all this because we have been since we had the first personal computers in the 80s, building different regulations. So we have data modeling for analyzing the tariffs that is well structured and is easy to deploy quickly. Now, for example, with COVID, the social tariffs in the places that we are, we have been so fast in deploy that. Less than 1 day, everyone is applying the new tariff. So new kind of tariffs in different cities. This is a hard question because usually the tariffs should respond to the cost of production of the water. And we can be so imaginative, but sometimes the simple is the best. So we need to, we can, for example, have tariffs by schedules, different tariffs in different schedules, and we can do that, but sometimes not the better. So what we can do is to advise to the people that need about what's the best way to deploy the tariff.
Thank you, Jaime. Actually, I have a follow-up question based on what you mentioned about changes in light of COVID to David. But before I use this privilege to pose my question, I want to thank everyone who's sending their questions to us. I want to assure all our audience members that every question will be answered by our esteemed panel. If not now, then you'll find the whole recording of the webinar later on. And the answers on Idrica's website. David, I wanted to quickly bring this to you, what Jaime said about changes in billings in light of COVID-19. If a public protest breaks out in light of the changing situation, vis-a-vis, let's say, increase in tariffs or decrease in tariffs or whatever, would you consider this a water-related security threat?
It can be. I think that water is one of the very few sources of leading indicators or predictive data about the impact of the coronavirus. And Jaime talked about this in his presentation, but smart metering and smart technology, I think, offers us a huge amount of opportunity here. The chances of an uprising or of civil unrest or conflict really spike when the government is seen to be authoritarian and it's cracking down on people in a broad way that isn't justified, and that generates a feeling of injustice and conflict. Jaime can probably talk to this better than I, but if you can predict through smart infrastructure where you're getting a surge in water usage, or even if you can use smart metering to detect the presence of a virus, for example, in sewage systems, then you can, without squashing people's civil liberties or locking people down who don't need to be locked down, you can very carefully target your response so that it improves public safety without making people feel like they're being unfairly targeted. And I think everybody in the world wants to be protected from the effects of the virus, but nobody wants this to become an excuse for a regime to destroy their civil liberties. And I think the opportunity of smart metering and of smart infrastructure, particularly on water, because it's a predictive datum source, is potentially transformative in the way we respond here.
That does make sense. Thanks, David. I want to now take this back to Jaime. I'm actually enjoying it as a former journalist. This is my jam to roll between questions. So David is saying that data is the future, and Jaime works in that domain. But how accurate, and it's actually one of the questions here, how accurate are the real-time forecasts in the face of unexpected crises, such as, let's say, the COVID-19? An example would be, suddenly everyone is at home. So I can imagine that the domestic consumption of water has increased. So how predictable and accurate are your forecasts, and can you base policies on the data? Please, Jaime.
Yeah, we are managing to forecast demand now. One of them is the one of the network. And what we have, the technology that we have, the forecast demand that we manage is the next 15 minutes forecast demand based on the historical and based on what is happening now, based on the model. We use the modeling to analyze what's going to happen in the next 15 minutes. We calibrate with smart metering, with other things, and with GIS and so on. But what we have is the forecast demand for the next 15 minutes. So for that, we don't need, we don't mind what's happening with COVID or with other hard situations, because the system is adapting to what is happening and recommends the things with the valves and the pumps that we should do in the next 15 minutes, because we have the information of the needs that we are going to have, of pressure and flow, in the next 15 minutes. So this is one thing. But the other thing, the patterns of consumption inside the households, for example, but this is different. Of course, it has changed, or in the industries, or the final customer, of course, this has changed. It has changed a lot. But we have been lucky, maybe, because what has happened is that in the households, the pattern is the same of the holidays day of each country. For example, in Europe, the holidays day is Sunday. For example, in Qatar, the holiday day is Friday. So this day represents what is happening with confinement. Why is that? Because people go to sleep later and wake up later, and the times are different. There is changes that we have seen with historical data, and these kind of changes are the clappings at 8 o'clock and something, this kind of things. So if we have a change of pattern, a change of behavior so different from the past, we would need an historical to get this pattern. But as the change of behavior is the same as one of the days that we have in the past, we have the pattern. So it has been easy for us to get that.
Thank you, Jaime. That was wonderful. Thank you. I've received a question about Middle East growing population. So I was able to quickly Google, David. And basically, as you know, Middle East population will double in size by 2050. Some countries such as Iraq, Bahrain, and Palestine, for example, are projected to grow by almost 50%, while others such as Syria and Oman by 40%. That's huge. And basically the question is, would this rise in population in the region add further challenges to water security dimension? And is slowing the population growth rate the answer here?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And it's one that I actually addressed in great detail about 7 years ago in a book that I wrote called Out of the Mountains, where I talked about rapid urban growth. And I pointed to a number of mega trends, one of which is population growth, another is urbanization, and the third one is what geographers call littoralization, which is the tendency for populations to cluster on coastlines, which is a very notable trend in the region we're talking about in the Middle East. So I don't actually think that stopping the growth of populations is feasible. And even if it was feasible, I think it's probably a pretty authoritarian way to deal with this particular problem. I think we're actually not close to running out of water yet in the region. It's a question of distribution. It's also a question of modernizing infrastructure, because there's an enormous amount of wastage that happens, particularly in urban water supply across the region. I showed a few examples of that in my presentation. And again, the use of smart metering, better infrastructure, covering a lot of the open canals that are used for water movement to prevent evaporation, and then the development of some new technologies, which could be desalination, which is very commonly used in the Arabian Gulf. It could be atmospheric water capture. There are a number of other technologies that are out there. But I think ultimately it's about managing resources, and I'll go back to my general theme of conflict, managing them in an equitable way. We mentioned Palestine. I think that's a great example where there are ways to manage the water resources that we have and to be more efficient and more fair in the way we distribute those, which I think is probably the best way to deal with that growing population.
David, I was curious. I've always been fascinated by this question, so I'll utilize your presence here finally and ask you, I mean, isn't it true that humans, in an anthropological sense, grew up, the civilizations of our times or ancient times grew up near rivers because water provided the resource? So you mentioned coastal cities. Is that something new? I thought it has always been the case.
Yeah, it isn't a new phenomenon. And of course, we know that the most advanced civilizations originally arose in the Fertile Crescent around rivers and lakes, and what we call hydraulic civilizations that were based on careful control and use of water rapidly became very specialized and sophisticated, and cities and politics as we know them today originally arose from that relationship of water to production and government. The other factor that I would point to is that for all of human history, even until now, it has been much more feasible to transport heavy goods by water than by land, just for reasons of physics, you know. And so trading posts tend to occur on the edge of lakes, on rivers, in ports, because that's where you can do intermodal transport to enable trade. And if we map out the trade routes that moved across the region in ancient times, they follow water. You know, it's a fundamental defining feature. But of course, what we're seeing here is rapid population growth and people moving to cities in search of a better life, of economic growth, and so on. And they move to existing cities. And because existing cities are already on the coastlines, this just exacerbates or increases an existing tendency. And of course, you can go back to even Khaldun, you know, in the 11th century, and he talks about, you know, the rise of the urban population and how people that are not in the city flock to the city and then bring it down. And, you know, this idea of Khaldunian circulation, which is very well understood now in anthropology. Again, it's a factor of access to water, which is why the city is there in the first place.
This is just a stunning reminder to me on a personal level how powerful water as an element is. I mean, you know, we obviously take it for granted. Thank you, David. Thanks. To Jaime, you know, David just alluded to the fact that rapid urbanization is a reality. And yes, you have the technology to protect water networks. And yes, you're innovating in that area. But what are the future threats to water networks, in the area of cyber protection? And what is Idrica doing?
Yeah, there's a lot of technologies that can be studied, and what happens with cybersecurity is that you should be in front of the technologies continuously. This is difficult because every year the hackers and the protectors have the advance in their technology that finally are the same. And the technologies of the one that make the attack and the one that make the defense. So which kind of technologies? I have explained just before some of them. Technologies to, for example, technologies to, it's usual to have a lot of devices with a lot of hardware, different, and you need a technology that make homogeneous all this kind of data that connect all what is happening with one manufacturer's devices with what is happening with another one. And for this kind of things, what we have or what we do, for example, is to invest a lot in companies that are working in this kind of technology. We have a fund, and we have a 20 million euro fund that we use to invest in a technological hub where we are inside companies that deploy different kinds of technology, 5G technologies, and cybersecurity technologies and hardware technologies. In this fund, what we do is to be part of the development of this kind of technologies. We have, for example, one of the companies that is dedicated just exclusively to cybersecurity defense.
I mean, out of innocent curiosity and perhaps naivete, what kind of people would want to attack a public water network? I mean, are these
state-sponsored?
No,
we're surprised about this.
but I mean, are these state-sponsored people? Are these just a bunch of hooligans? I mean, are these a bunch of
there is two or three kinds of people, more or less. There is the one that make that as a challenge. I want to access and I want to break the fences and I want to know how to do it. Okay, that's maybe innocent. Okay, there is another one that make for money. I'm able, so I can be contracted for another guy, and for example, in industrial wars, you can make fail to the other one when you are working for a tender. Okay, so they are hackers that are paid to make fail to one contractor, and the other one, of course, is the defense of the nations. There is attacks between different nations, and all the nations try to have defense of the military defense and the infrastructures of water, as David has been explaining every time, are critical infrastructures, are infrastructures that can start with wars, and one governments try to attack to other ones. This is something usual.
Thank you. Thanks. I was just curious, but I'm now also curious to take this to David, because I can perhaps ask him if he has seen instances of people using threats of causing damage to water security network as some sort of a war advantage. But before I do that, David, I want to announce to everyone that there will be a poll at the end of this webinar, and that everyone is invited to please have a go at the poll. David, do you want to come in on what Jaime said from a technology sabotage perspective, but from a geopolitical angle?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned in my presentation, the weaponization of water resources to control populations is extraordinarily common. And this can range from, you know, an oppressive government poisoning water supplies in a remote area as a way of forcing nomadic populations to move away from that area. And this happened in North Africa in a number of conflicts, to insurgents targeting agricultural supply. I use the example of Sri Lanka, of the Mavalaru sluice, where the Tamil Tigers shut down the irrigation water for 1 million people. We also see, for example, in the fight in Aleppo and in Daraa in Syria, the regime fighting very hard to control water supply. And one of the biggest battles in the war in Syria was for the control of a series of springs east of Damascus, because at one time the government felt that it was going to simply not have enough water for the basic needs of the Syrian population, because Islamic State was controlling those. And there's a twist on that, because one of the reasons why the Islamic State sought to control those water supplies was because that allowed them to then sell water to the regime. And actually, one of the things that we've seen in the Syrian civil war is different groups selling electricity and selling water to their enemies as a way of generating revenue. So I think there's a number of ways, but I really take Jaime's point that in a distributed water network with critical infrastructure, which is powered by SCADA systems that can be hacked, you know, the emergence of the Internet of Things actually increases the attack surface for a sophisticated non-state actor, or for a hybrid actor like a government that's sponsoring a non-state attack. So I think it's something that we all need to be paying very close attention to, particularly in the Middle East, but I think this is a generic problem everywhere now.
Thanks, David. Yes, go ahead, David, please.
Sorry. When I was explaining in the presentation that you need sometimes a data modeling quality of water system to be able to alert if the composition of water has changed, and to model what's going to happen in this situation, to close, for example, an area because you have been attacking the network. It's something that is not usual. It's something that it does happen, but there is today real events where in places that it has happened, and when it has happened, in the cases that I know, the operators be aware of the situation, and has alert and has changed the network. But it was a lucky thing, because the operators were in that moment paying attention and working properly. That would be good always, but always don't happen this. So we cannot depend of manual. I think that we cannot depend of manual watching to protect the citizens. We need for that modeling. This is complicated. This is expensive. Modeling the quality of water, you need multi-parametric zones, and it's truly expensive. But I think that in the future, not today, but in the future, should be mandatory, as today is, to have remote solutions for COVID. And I want to answer one question that you haven't made, that you have told before one thing, if you don't mind.
Yes, please go ahead.
You talked before about sewage network and how we can analyze the COVID, the genetical units of COVID inside sewage network. We have been working for 3 years to have laboratories to analyze virus, not thinking of COVID, thinking of analyzing of virus inside our laboratories. And with all the tools of monitoring, we have a package of tools where we are able to analyze, to find the behavior of the COVID in sewage water, not just in the population plants, but in the sewage network too, in strategic points of the sewage network, and to know and to get information about the different neighborhoods and the behavior of these neighborhoods with the COVID. This is now what we don't have yet, is that enough historical data to know, for example, behaviors as if someone use more hygienic products in some place that is killing the virus inside the sewage network. For example, this can put noise on the results, and these kind of things we are cleaning now because we have started to analyze this. But we are already deploying in 3 cities the pre-alert to the city if they have if there is a virus in the sewage. So in the next campaign of coronavirus, not campaign, but in the next time that we are going to be confined, that probably is October, November, we are going to alert early to the citizens for that.
Thank you, Jaime. It's still fascinating to me as an information person, not knowing the technical side of water, how I just take it for granted. I open the tap, I drink water. I had no idea how much technology and security and safety and resource security is involved in getting that water all the way to my tap. So it's really fascinating. We have time for one more question that I will direct to both David and Jaime, and invite them also at the same time to add their concluding remarks if they have any. I'll start with David. The question is, do you think we would witness an all-out war specifically over the issue of water in our lifetimes? And are there steps that can be taken to avoid this?
So people have been predicting water wars for a generation. And you mentioned the Indus dispute in one of your comments earlier. That was one of the earliest examples. The Jordan River has been another one, the Congo, the Mekong River. And generally these are framed in terms of disputes over rivers or access to lakes and so on. I think this is also true very much in Latin America. We've seen wars in the past that have been fought over access to the sea. And I think that's likely to continue to be a risk. I think the only way that we're going to be able to avoid an all-out war over water in our lifetime is going to be working really hard at regional dispute resolution mechanisms. And I say that rather than global ones, because I think it's usually bilateral negotiations supported by regional bodies where you get a better outcome. And I think that needs to be a key focus if we don't want to see that kind of conflict. I'll just point to one other more sort of, just to end on a very dystopian note. What we haven't seen yet is mass population movement triggered by, say, climate change or by people fleeing a disease like this pandemic, and having one whole population move en masse into the territory of somebody else. And that could potentially happen, and that would trigger not necessarily a state-on-state conflict, but a very large-scale conflict potentially. And I think we need to be very alert to that possibility.
Thank you, David. That idea is shocking to even imagine, but thank you very much. It has been very, very insightful. I'll direct the same question to Jaime, but from a technology point of view. If in case there's an all-out war specifically over water, are there technologies that we have to avoid that or to stem the conflict to get completely out of hand? Please, Jaime.
Sorry, I lose the sound. Could
Sorry,
you repeat the last?
No problem. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah. Now,
I was bringing the same question from David to you and invite your opinion. whether if in case there's an all-out war in future, what is the technology response to it? Are there ways to avoid the conflict or to quickly kill it?
Yes,
Please.
yes. We can monitor what's happening in the water, and what we should do, and probably maybe I shouldn't tell this, but I'm going to tell. We are preparing some technology to make democratic to the access to the technology. So what it should happen in the world is that we need for the world to democratize the access to technology, the access to monitoring, the access to analyze the infrastructures. And what's happening today is that the management of the infrastructures of water is in the hands of high specialists, and of course of administration close to the governments. This should be in the same way, but they should be controlled by the citizens, and they should have all the information published for the citizens to see that everything is okay, that all the water management is okay, that the quality of water is okay, and so on. And if we democratize the technology, we can get the solutions for one person in one country in the world that is in a little city. They don't have access to technologies, but maybe if the systems are democratized, they can manage the water without pressures of bad governments. There is good governments and bad governments, and the bad governments is usually the ones that generate this kind of work. So without the pressure of the bad governments, they are able to manage this because they have this kind of data. So technology is everything to manage the water.
I'm glad I asked that question because I could see how passionate you became. So thank you very much, Jaime, for taking it. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Once again, this session was entirely recorded. It will be available on Idrica's website. I apologize if some of the questions were not answered. Please rest assured that we will be posting them on Idrica's website again, answered by David and Jaime. And thank you very much for your time, as well as for taking our survey. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much, David
Thank you.
and
Bye.
Sarmad. Thank you.
Thank you so much.